In 1944, they took us out of our classrooms and handed us rifles. We were told we were the last hope of a dying empire. They said the Americans would torture us, starve us, parade us like animals. But nothing they told us was true. This is the story of how boys became soldiers, and how soldiers became prisoners in a land they were taught to hate. I was 15 when they told me I belonged to history. It was March 1944. The snow outside our school in a small German town had just begun to melt, turning the yard into gray slush. We were supposed to be studying mathematics that morning. Instead, 2 uniformed officers walked into our classroom and asked our teacher to step outside. She never came back in. When the door reopened, the principal stood there, pale and stiff, reading from a paper that trembled in his hands. Boys born in 1928 and 1929, report to the assembly hall immediately. No one spoke. We already knew. For months, rumors had been spreading. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied bombs were turning cities into skeletons of brick and smoke. Fathers were dead or missing. Older brothers had vanished into snow and mud somewhere in Russia or France. Now it was our turn. In the assembly hall, they lined us up by height. Some of us still had ink stains on our fingers. One boy had brought a comic book in his satchel. Another whispered that this might be an honor. We had grown up on speeches, banners, and promises. We had been told we were special, forged in discipline, hardened by ideology, chosen to defend the fatherland. They didn't ask if we were ready. They handed us forms to sign. I remember looking at my friend Carl. He was smaller than me, with freckles across his nose. He still laughed at stupid jokes. He still ran home every afternoon because his mother worried when he was late. When the officer placed the document in front of him, Carl's hands shook so badly that the pen scratched through the paper. "You are soldiers now," the officer said. But soldiers of what? Of victory? Of desperation? Training lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks to turn boys into defenders of a collapsing Reich. They shaved our heads. They replaced our school uniforms with ill-fitting field gray jackets. They put boots on our feet that were too big for some, too small for others. We learned to disassemble rifles before we learned how to shave. We learned how to throw grenades before we had ever kissed a girl. At night, we whispered in the barracks. No one wanted to admit fear. Fear was weakness. Weakness was betrayal. So we talked about medals. About proving ourselves. About coming home heroes. But when the lights went out, I could hear the quiet sounds, muffled crying, shallow breathing, prayers spoken into pillows. The officers told us the enemy was merciless. "They will kill you if you surrender," one instructor barked. "They will torture you. They will humiliate you. Fight until your last bullet." We believed him. Because we were 15. The first time I fired my rifle at a real target was not during training. It was in a forest outside the town where we had grown up. The air smelled of wet soil and smoke. Artillery thunder rolled in the distance like a storm that never moved on. We were positioned along a shallow trench line. My hands were sweating so badly I thought the rifle would slip from my grip. And then we saw them. American soldiers advancing carefully between trees. They looked ordinary. That was the first crack in the story we had been told. They did not look like monsters. They looked like men. The gunfire started before I could process anything else. The sound was deafening. Earth exploded beside me. Someone screamed, I don't know who. I remember firing blindly, my shoulder jerking with recoil, my ears ringing so violently it felt like drowning. Carl was next to me. And then he wasn't. I don't remember him falling. I don't remember blood. I only remember turning my head and seeing his helmet lying in the mud. We had been soldiers for less than a month. And already, childhood had ended in a trench. The battle didn't last long. We were untrained, undersupplied, terrified. When American tanks pushed forward, something inside us collapsed. The officers shouted for us to hold the line. But how does a 15-year-old hold a line against steel? Some boys ran. Some froze. Some kept firing because they didn't know what else to do. I remember the moment I realized we were going to lose. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. It was quiet. I looked at my hands, shaking, filthy, scraped raw, and I understood that the speeches, the flags, the songs, none of them were here in the forest with us. Only fear was. An explosion knocked me flat. Dirt filled my mouth. When I lifted my head, I saw an American soldier standing just a few meters away, rifle aimed directly at me. I thought of everything we had been told. They will kill you if you surrender. They will show no mercy. My finger hovered near the trigger. But I couldn't pull it. I dropped the rifle. The American shouted something I didn't understand. His voice sounded tense, but not cruel. He motioned for me to raise my hands. I expected a bullet. Instead, I felt hands pulling me up. I was searched. My pockets emptied. My helmet removed. Someone pushed me forward toward a group of other captured boys, boys I recognized from school. We stood there, trembling, waiting for the punishment we had been promised. It never came. No one shot us. No one beat us. An American soldier, barely older than my older brother had been, looked at us with something I didn't expect. Confusion. Jesus, I heard him mutter. They're kids. Kids. The word felt like an insult and a relief at the same time. We had been told we were the future of the Reich. The last shield against destruction. Warriors forged by destiny. But standing there, hands raised, dirt on our faces, tears cutting through the grime, we were just boys who should have been in school. That night, they put us in a makeshift holding area. We expected interrogation, violence, revenge. Instead, we were given water, bread, blankets. The silence among us was heavier than any artillery barrage. Because something had shifted. If the enemy was not a monster, then what had we been fighting for? And if we were not heroes, then what were we? That was the night the illusion began to die. We had left school believing we were stepping into glory. We stepped instead into captivity. And captivity, we would soon learn, was not the horror we had imagined, but the beginning of a truth far more unsettling than war itself. They had told us captivity was worse than dying. That was the sentence echoing in my head the first night we slept behind American barbed wire. The holding area was nothing more than a fenced field near the edge of a forest. Floodlights burned through the darkness. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the ground, turning boys into thin ghosts. We huddled together in silence, boots pressed into cold earth, blankets wrapped tight around shoulders that had been carrying rifles only hours earlier. No one spoke the word prisoner. But we all felt it. Prisoner meant shame. Prisoner meant betrayal. Prisoner meant we had failed. And in the world we had grown up in, failure was unforgivable. Carl's absence felt heavier in captivity than it had in battle. In battle, everything had been noise and instinct. In the quiet of the camp, memory crept in slowly, like fog. I kept seeing his helmet in the mud. I kept hearing his pen scratching across the enlistment form. We were supposed to fight to the last bullet. Instead, we had dropped our rifles. The first interrogation came at dawn. They called us one by one into a tent. I expected shouting. I expected fists. I expected the brutality we had been warned about since childhood. I walked in with my jaw clenched, determined to say nothing. The American officer inside looked tired. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes red from lack of sleep. A translator stood beside him. The officer glanced at my file. "Age?" he asked. 15, the translator repeated in German. The officer looked up at me, confused. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. "Jesus Christ," he muttered again. He asked simple questions: name, hometown, unit. Nothing more. No threats. No screaming. When it was over, he handed me something I didn't expect. A cigarette. I didn't smoke. My father had forbidden it. But I took it anyway, hands trembling. It was the first time an enemy had treated me like a human being. Back in the fenced field, rumors spread fast. Some boys said the Americans were pretending, that the torture would start later. Others insisted we were being fattened up before execution. Fear feeds on imagination, and we had vivid imaginations. We had been raised on stories of cruelty. Posters, films, speeches, they had painted the enemy as savage, inhuman. We had believed it without question. But now the narrative was cracking. That afternoon, trucks arrived. We were ordered to line up and climb aboard. The metal floor vibrated under our boots as engines roared to life. Guards sat at the back, rifles resting casually across their knees. They didn't aim them at us. The convoy moved west. We didn't know where we were going. Some boys whispered about labor camps. Others feared we would be shipped across the ocean, a rumor so absurd it felt like fiction. Days later, after processing centers and more questioning, the rumor became reality. We were going to America. The word hung in the air like something unreal. America, the land of gangsters and chaos, according to everything we had been told. The place where we would surely be humiliated and displayed as trophies of victory. The journey across the Atlantic was long and disorienting. Packed into transport ships, we slept in tight rows, the smell of salt and oil clinging to everything. Seasickness spread quickly. Some boys vomited for days. Others lay staring at the steel ceiling, whispering prayers. At night, I would close my eyes and try to remember my mother's face. I worried she believed I was dead. I wondered if she would ever know I was alive, a prisoner on a ship headed toward the enemy. One evening, I overheard two American sailors talking above deck. They laughed about baseball. One complained about missing home. Their conversation was ordinary, painfully ordinary. It struck me then, they were homesick too. That realization was more unsettling than any threat. After weeks at sea, we arrived at a harbor I later learned was on the east coast of the United States. The skyline rose in the distance, unfamiliar, towering, alive. We were marched off the ship under heavy guard. I braced myself for hatred. Instead, I saw curiosity. Civilians had gathered at a distance, watching us file past. Some stared in silence. A few shook their heads. I caught the eye of an older woman standing near a truck. Her expression wasn't rage. It was sadness. We were transported inland to a prisoner of war camp surrounded by fencing and watchtowers. It looked intimidating, but inside, something felt different from what we had imagined. There were barracks. Real beds. A mess hall. The first meal stunned us: bread, beans, meat, even fruit. We eyed it suspiciously. "Why are they feeding us like this?" someone whispered. No one had an answer. The days settled into routine. Roll call. Chores. Limited recreation. English lessons offered by a volunteer through the fence. The guards enforced rules strictly, but without cruelty. Punishments meant extra duties, not beatings. And slowly, something began to shift inside us. Without constant propaganda, without the shouting and the speeches, the world felt quieter. We had time to think, a dangerous luxury. At night, conversations changed. We no longer spoke of medals. We spoke of home. Of mothers waiting in ruined towns. Of fathers we might never see again. Of the lies we had believed because we were too young to question them. One afternoon, while repairing a fence under supervision, a local farmer approached with permission from the guards. He looked at us the way one might look at stray animals, cautious, unsure. Then he handed a basket of apples to the guard. "For the boys," he said. The boys. Not soldiers. Not enemies. Boys. We devoured the apples in silence, juice running down our chins. I hadn't tasted anything so fresh in months. It was then that the final thread of fear snapped. Captivity was not the horror we had been promised. But that realization brought its own torment. If the enemy was capable of kindness, then what had we been defending? If they saw us as children, why had our own leaders sent us to die? These questions haunted the barracks more than nightmares ever could. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the watchtower, I sat on my bunk and stared at my hands, the same hands that had held a rifle weeks earlier. They looked smaller now. Younger. For the first time since that day in the classroom, I allowed myself to admit it. I didn't want to be a soldier. I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to argue about football scores. I wanted to complain about homework. But history had other plans. We had crossed an ocean as prisoners. And in doing so, we had crossed something far more dangerous, the line between belief and truth. We had feared captivity more than death. What we hadn't feared was doubt. And doubt, once planted, grows faster than any army. The first time I stepped outside the camp under open sky without a rifle in my hands, I felt naked. Not because I was afraid. Because I didn't know who I was without the uniform. By late summer of 1944, the camp administration began transferring small groups of us to work details on nearby farms. America was short on labor. Many of its own young men were overseas, fighting in Europe and the Pacific. So the irony was brutal. German boys, captured in war, were now helping feed American families. When they read my name from the list, my stomach tightened. We had heard stories from older prisoners. Some farms were harsh, some indifferent. But many were unexpectedly human. I was loaded into the back of a truck with 8 other boys. The road stretched endlessly between fields of corn and tobacco. The land was vast, larger than anything I had ever seen in Germany. No ruins. No craters. No smoke rising from bombed cities. It felt unfair. The war existed here only in newspapers. When we arrived, the farmer was waiting. He wasn't what I expected. No hatred in his eyes. No clenched fists. Just a tall, broad-shouldered man with sunburned skin and tired posture. Beside him stood a woman in a faded blue dress and 2 small children clutching her skirt. The guard introduced us briefly. The farmer nodded. "They're just boys," he said quietly. "Let's get to work." That sentence stayed with me. Just boys. Work on the farm was hard but honest. We woke before sunrise, collected eggs, repaired fences, carried hay bales until our arms trembled. The farmer watched us closely at first, as if expecting sabotage. But days passed. No one tried to escape. No one caused trouble. Where would we even go? We didn't speak English. We had no money. No map. No home to run toward. The farmer's wife brought water out to the fields each afternoon. Once, she handed me a glass directly instead of placing it on the ground. Her fingers brushed mine. It was a small, meaningless gesture, but it shattered something inside me. I had expected distance, contempt. Instead, there was compassion. The children were the most unsettling part. The boy, maybe 8 years old, stared at us constantly. One day, he approached while I was fixing a wooden post. He held a baseball in his hand and said something I couldn't understand. I shook my head. He tried again, slower. Play? I didn't know the rules of baseball, but I knew the universal language of throwing a ball. So I threw it back. For a few minutes, war disappeared. We were just two boys tossing something between us, laughing at bad throws. The farmer watched from a distance. He didn't stop it. That evening in the bunkhouse we shared near the barn, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how easily we had been told to hate people like them. How confidently we had believed that Americans were monsters. Monsters don't give water to thirsty prisoners. Monsters don't let their children play with the enemy. But the conflict inside me was violent. If they were not monsters, what did that make us? News from Europe filtered in slowly. Germany was retreating. Cities were burning. The Reich that had promised eternity was collapsing in months. Some of the older prisoners reacted with anger. They blamed betrayal, bad strategy, cowardly generals. But among us younger boys, something else was happening. We were beginning to question everything. One afternoon, while stacking hay in the loft, the farmer climbed up beside me. We worked in silence for several minutes before he spoke. "My son's in France," he said, nodding toward the horizon. "About your age." I froze. He pulled a folded photograph from his pocket and handed it to me. The boy in the picture looked barely older than I was. He wore an American uniform and tried to smile for the camera. "He writes when he can," the farmer continued. "Says he's scared most days." Scared. The word hit harder than any accusation. I had been told American soldiers were fearless, ruthless machines. But this man's son was scared. Just like me. Just like Carl had been. The farmer took the photo back carefully and tucked it into his shirt. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I will never forget. "You didn't start this war." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was recognition. That night, I lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling beams. The world I had grown up in, the speeches, the uniforms, the certainty, felt distant and artificial. Here, in this quiet American countryside, the war seemed stripped of slogans. It was just fathers and sons on opposite sides of an ocean. Weeks passed. Trust grew in subtle ways. The farmer no longer counted tools obsessively at the end of the day. His wife sometimes added an extra slice of pie to our supper. The little boy brought me a book filled with simple English words, pointing and laughing as I struggled to pronounce them. "Friend," he said once, tapping the page. "Friend." I repeated it awkwardly. "Friend." The word felt dangerous. Because if we could be friends, then what had all the hatred been for? One evening, a thunderstorm rolled across the fields. Lightning split the sky, and rain poured so heavily it turned the dirt paths into rivers. The barn roof began leaking near the animals. Without being asked, we rushed to help move equipment and secure the livestock. For hours we worked side by side with the farmer, soaked to the bone, shouting over thunder. When it was over, we stood there panting in the rain. He clapped my shoulder. "Good work," he said. In that moment, I wasn't a prisoner. I wasn't an enemy. I was just a boy trying to prove he could still be useful in a world he barely understood anymore. But the closer we grew to this strange, fragile normality, the heavier the guilt became. Back home, cities were crumbling. Mothers were starving. And here we were, eating well, sleeping safely, learning a new language under open skies untouched by bombs. It felt wrong. Survival often does. As autumn approached, rumors began circulating in the camp. The war might end sooner than anyone expected. The Reich was bleeding out. Soviet forces were advancing. Allied troops were pushing deeper into Germany. Some boys cheered quietly. Others wept. Because the end of the war did not mean the end of consequences. We would have to go back. Back to ruins. Back to shame. Back to a country forced to face what had been done in its name. One evening, the farmer's son threw the baseball to me again. "Friend," he said, grinning. I caught it cleanly this time. And for the first time since 1944, I allowed myself to imagine a future that didn't involve rifles, trenches, or propaganda. A future where being called a boy was not an insult. But freedom, I would soon learn, can feel heavier than captivity. Because when the gates finally open, you must decide who you truly are. The word followed us everywhere. Boys. Not soldiers. Not Nazis. Not enemies. Boys. By the winter of 1944, the farm no longer felt like foreign territory. It felt like a fragile pause between two worlds. The routine was steady: work at dawn, supper at dusk, guarded transport back to camp on certain nights. Snow dusted the fields white, turning everything quiet and almost unreal. And yet, the war was getting louder. News reached us through newspapers the guards sometimes left behind. We pieced together headlines with our broken English: Allied forces advancing, cities falling, Germany retreating on all fronts. Every victory for America meant defeat for home. And that contradiction tore at us. One afternoon, the farmer's wife placed a newspaper on the table after lunch. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me and gently pushed it closer. There was a photograph on the front page. Ruins. Buildings reduced to skeletons. Smoke rising from what had once been neighborhoods. The caption mentioned a German city I recognized, not far from where my aunt lived. My hands began to shake. Until that moment, Germany had existed in my mind as memory: cobblestone streets, schoolyards, my mother's kitchen window glowing at dusk. But the image on that page was not memory. It was devastation. The farmer noticed my silence. He didn't say, "This is your fault." He didn't say, "You deserve this." He simply poured coffee and let the silence sit between us. That silence was heavier than accusation. That night in the bunkhouse, the other boys were restless. Some had seen similar images. Some had heard rumors from new arrivals at the camp, stories of concentration camps being discovered, of horrors we had never been told about. At first, we denied it. Propaganda, we said. Lies meant to break us. But doubt had already taken root months earlier. And doubt doesn't disappear when you command it to. One of the older prisoners, Dieter, had access to more translated news through a guard who practiced German with him. One evening, Dieter returned pale and silent. "They found camps," he said quietly. No one responded. "They found prisoners. Starved. Dead. The room felt smaller. I wanted to argue. To shout that it couldn't be true. That we would have known. That someone would have told us. But that was the problem. We hadn't known. Or maybe we had chosen not to look. The following weeks were filled with invisible weight. Every time the farmer's son laughed, every time the little girl handed me a folded drawing she had made, guilt burned sharper. They treated us with kindness. And we began to understand that the uniform we had worn carried something darker than we had ever imagined. One evening, as I was repairing a section of fence, the farmer approached with slow steps. Snow crunched beneath his boots. "My boy wrote again," he said. I braced myself. "He says they're moving through Germany now." He didn't say it with pride. He said it with worry. "They're finding things," he added quietly. Our eyes met. For a second, I thought he might see everything written on my face: confusion, shame, fear. "You didn't know," he said finally. It wasn't a question. It was something like mercy. But mercy doesn't erase responsibility. It complicates it. Days later, something happened that shifted everything. A group of American soldiers visited the farm briefly, on leave from the front. One of them was the farmer's son. He stepped out of the truck thinner than in the photograph. Older. Hardened. When his father embraced him, I looked away. The soldier noticed us standing by the barn. His eyes narrowed. "You let them work here?" he asked sharply. "They help," the farmer replied calmly. "They're the enemy. They're kids." The tension in the air felt like a drawn wire. For the first time since arriving in America, I felt real hostility directed at me. The soldier walked toward us. Up close, I could see exhaustion etched into his face. Mud still clung to his boots. His hands trembled slightly. "How old are you?" he demanded. 16, I answered softly. He stared at me for a long time. 16, he repeated, almost to himself. Then something shifted in his expression, not forgiveness, not friendliness, but recognition. "I've seen what your people did," he said quietly. The words cut deep. But he didn't strike me. He didn't spit at me. Instead, he turned and walked back to the house without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. For months, we had been protected by the narrative that we were children caught in something larger. But standing in front of that soldier, I understood something new. Being young does not erase what your country has done. And yet, being young also means you were shaped before you could choose. That contradiction was unbearable. In the weeks that followed, the war accelerated toward its end. Reports of Allied troops entering deeper into German territory became frequent. Berlin was surrounded. The Reich, the thousand-year empire, was dying in less than 12. One evening in early May 1945, the camp loudspeaker crackled. Germany had surrendered. The words felt unreal. Some boys collapsed onto their bunks, sobbing. Others stared blankly at walls. A few whispered prayers of relief. I felt nothing at first. Then, slowly, something else crept in. If the war was over, who were we now? We were no longer soldiers. We were no longer defenders of anything. We were boys in a foreign country, wearing the uniform of a defeated regime, carrying the weight of truths we had only just begun to understand. The next morning, when I arrived at the farm, the farmer removed his hat and looked at me carefully. "It's over," he said. I nodded. The farmer's son stood behind him. He didn't look at me with hatred this time. He looked tired. "We'll see what happens now," he muttered. That was the beginning of the hardest part. Not the fighting. Not the captivity. Not even the doubt. But the waiting. Waiting to be sent back to a homeland in ruins. Waiting to face what had been done. Waiting to rebuild an identity without banners or slogans. The little boy ran up to me that afternoon with his baseball. "Friend," he asked, hopeful. I hesitated. Because friendship felt like betrayal to everything I had been taught. But it also felt like the only honest thing left. I caught the ball and threw it back. "Yes," I said quietly. "Friend." And in that simple exchange, I understood something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. We had been called enemies. But we were still boys. And boys can change. When the gates finally opened, no one cheered. We had imagined this moment for months: freedom, release, the end of waiting. But when the announcement came that repatriation would begin, silence settled over the camp like fog. Freedom meant going home. And home no longer existed in the way we remembered it. The farmer shook my hand the last day I worked his fields. His grip was firm, steady, the same way it had been the first time I saw him standing beside that dusty road. "You'll rebuild," he said quietly. It wasn't a promise. It was a hope. His son stood nearby, arms crossed. There was no anger in his face now. Just distance. The war had taken something from him too, something I could never understand fully. The little boy ran up with the baseball one last time. "Friend," he said again, as if sealing a contract. I nodded. "Friend." But as I climbed onto the transport truck that would take us back to camp for processing, I realized something terrifying. I didn't know who I was returning as. We had left Germany as children dressed as soldiers. We were returning as former prisoners of war, carrying truths we had never been prepared to face. The journey back across the Atlantic felt longer than the first. This time, the ocean didn't separate enemies. It separated versions of ourselves. On deck at night, I would stare into the black water and think about Carl. About the classroom. About the speeches that once made my heart race with pride. I tried to locate the moment when belief turned into doubt. There was no single moment. It was a slow unraveling. A cigarette offered by an enemy. An apple handed across a fence. A baseball thrown in a snowy field. A newspaper photograph of ruins. Truth had not arrived as an explosion. It arrived quietly. When we finally docked in Europe, the air felt heavier. Colder. Familiar and foreign at the same time. The train that carried us inland passed through towns that looked like broken teeth, buildings hollowed out, roofs missing, windows staring back like empty eyes. This was the homeland we had sworn to defend. And we had failed. When I stepped off the train near my hometown, my legs trembled. The school was still standing. The assembly hall where they had lined us up by height still existed. But many houses around it did not. I walked slowly toward my street, heart pounding so hard I thought it might split my ribs. My house was damaged but standing. The door opened before I could knock. My mother stared at me as if seeing a ghost. For a long second, neither of us moved. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me so tightly I could barely breathe. She didn't ask about battles. She didn't ask about America. She only whispered, "You're alive." And in that moment, I understood something simple and devastating. That was all she had ever wanted. Alive. The weeks that followed were harder than the war itself. There were no parades for us. No medals. No speeches. Only rubble and silence. People didn't want to talk about what had happened. Some pretended it had all been a misunderstanding. Others blamed leaders who were now dead. Many simply focused on survival, finding food, repairing walls, standing in endless lines for rations. But at night, I would lie awake and think about the camps the Americans had found. About the truths that were now impossible to deny. About the word enemy and how easily it had been assigned. I felt shame. Not because I had been 15, but because I had believed so completely. One evening, I found the enlistment paper I had signed months earlier. It was folded inside an old book in my room. My handwriting looked younger than I remembered. Under my name was the Declaration of Loyalty. I stared at it for a long time. Then I took out a blank sheet of paper. I began to write. Not to my government. Not to a commander. Not to history. I wrote to the farmer in America. I told him about the ruins. About my mother's tears. About how I had once believed everything without question. I thanked him for the apples, for the work, for not looking at me like I was only a uniform. I told him his son had been right to feel anger. And I told him I hoped one day our countries would know each other not as enemies, but as fathers and sons who wanted the same simple things. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully. But I never sent it. Why? Because I realized the letter wasn't for him. It was for me. It was proof that the boy who had dropped his rifle in a forest had not died there. He had changed. The world would move on. Germany would rebuild. New generations would grow up without the banners and the shouting. But for those of us who had been pulled from classrooms in 1944, the memory would never fade. We were used. Not because we were evil. Because we were young. We had been told we were history's last hope. In truth, we were history's warning. Years later, when people asked where I had been during the war, I never began with the trench or the surrender. I began with the word that haunted and saved me. Boy. Because that is what I was. A boy handed a rifle. A boy who feared captivity more than death. A boy who crossed an ocean expecting monsters, and found humanity instead. And if there is anything worth remembering about 1944, it is this. Hatred is taught. But so is mercy. And sometimes, the most dangerous battlefield is not the one filled with guns. It is the one inside a child's mind.